It was generally conceded that the Flaxborough Literary Society's annual meeting could be relied upon to pass without excitement. Excitement, indeed, was something the committee discouraged by every means short of banning adjectives. The customary sequence, election of officers, the treasurer's figures, and the librarian's report on stock utilization was arranged so as to leave members drowsily content with their evening's sense of civic duty. On this occasion, however, the agenda received an unscheduled amendment. Miss Edith Gorse, the borough librarian, a lady whose rigidity of manner suggested she had been carefully pressed between the pages of Whitaker's Almanac in her youth and never properly shaken out, rose to deliver her report. Her spectacles glinted beneath the unforgiving church hall lights as she spoke of overdue fines, requests for Scandinavian thrillers, and the distressing decline in reference book consultations. It was when she turned to the subject of deposited materials that her discourse faltered. A pause ensued, long enough for the treasurer's snore to become audible. Then Miss Gorse produced from her attaché case a sheet of foolscap, and holding it away from her person as if it carried infection, read a brief note. Item: 1 volume, not belonging to library stock, placed in return receptacle, unlabelled. Upon examination, not a book, but a large ledger. Contents: entries written in an unfamiliar hand. Entries appear to be records of deceased persons, with dates. The murmurs this pronouncement occasioned ran along the rows like draughts through a badly fitted sash window. Mrs. Fosdyke, who prided herself on her knowledge of genealogy, demanded whether the ledger might be a parish register. Mr. Shipley, the greengrocer, muttered darkly about undertakers keeping side ledgers for tax purposes. Miss Gorse did not deign to answer. Instead, she laid the ledger upon the table with a distinct slap, as though daring anyone to deny its existence. Several members craned forward. The more squeamish leaned back. It was Mrs. Wiveton, the mayor's wife, and the sort of woman who assumed. Events occurred for the sole purpose of giving her an opinion about them, who broke the spell. Well, she declared, if the thing lists dead people, then one naturally wishes to know who wrote it and for what reason. It seems to me, her voice rose as though addressing the borough at large, that the police ought to be informed. This earned her the gratitude of those eager to escape further discussion, and the indignation of those who saw no reason to involve authority in matters that might yet be traced to mere clerical eccentricity. Nevertheless, when Inspector Purbright, of the Flaxborough Police, received a telephone message that night, he noted it without audible sigh. Experience had taught him that the borough's voluntary societies provided more work for the constabulary than its taverns. By morning, word had diffused through the town with the efficiency of smoke from a hayrick fire. According to various versions, the ledger contained names of prominent citizens or of persons not yet dead but soon to be, or of townsfolk long forgotten who had died in mysterious circumstances. One rumour insisted that a full-page entry was devoted to an alderman's indiscretion, though which alderman and what form the indiscretion took altered with each retelling. The library itself, usually a refuge of muffled coughs and dusty calm, enjoyed unprecedented patronage that day. Readers queued to return books early, each hoping for a glimpse of the sinister volume. Miss Gorse, unmoved by either curiosity or alarm, installed the ledger in a locked cabinet and stationed her junior assistant nearby, armed with nothing more lethal than a disapproving expression. Thus it was that Inspector Purbright, arriving in his habitual unhurried fashion, found the public imagination already well ahead of official knowledge. He entered the library, removed his hat, and offered Miss Gorse a courteous bow that she received as if it were a summons to order. "I understand," he said mildly, "that you have acquired an addition to your stock which is, shall we say, Unclassified. Miss Gorse sniffed, produced the key to the cabinet, and presented the ledger without comment. Purbright laid the book upon a table and turned a few pages. His face registered no more than mild interest, though his eyebrows, trained by long habit, acknowledged the curious neatness with which each name and date had been inscribed. There were indeed records of deaths, some from many years past, others alarmingly recent. He closed the volume carefully. "Most intriguing," he said, handing it back. "It would appear someone has been keeping rather close account of mortality in Flaxborough." Miss Gorse compressed her lips. "An account that has no business being returned with municipal property." "Quite so," said Purbright. "Yet we may find that the ledger is of more than bibliographical concern." And with that he took his leave, leaving behind a roomful of readers whose thirst for scandal had only been sharpened by his calm. The day following the Library Society's uneasy discovery saw Flaxborough's customary routines continuing, though not with their usual placidity. The town was adept at absorbing oddities, eccentric relations, illogical council decrees, sudden changes in the price of milk. But the notion that someone had been carefully cataloguing the dead and depositing that chronicle amongst the novels and gardening handbooks produced a peculiar restlessness. People discussed it in the manner of those who half enjoy being disconcerted. The market square hummed with talk from the early morning. Mrs. Balham, who dispensed buns and gossip in approximately equal portions from her stall, assured customers that her uncle's name was in the ledger. She had not seen it herself, but her cousin's lodger's sister had, which to Mrs. Balham was close enough to verification. Mr. Codlin, the undertaker, passed through the square that morning with his habitual air of muffled gravity. Normally, tradesmen greeted him with cautious respect. The living instinctively defer to those who escort them to the threshold of the other condition. But on this occasion, several heads turned after him, and a muttered exchange suggested that if anyone were to keep a private death register, he would be the obvious candidate. Meanwhile, the ledger itself remained in police possession. Inspector Purbright, having carried it to his office, left it resting on the corner of his desk as though to give it a chance to introduce itself. Detective Sergeant Love, whose conscientiousness was equalled only by his anxiety about the proprieties of procedure, hovered nearby. "Unnatural, that's what it is," Love remarked after a lengthy silence. "Writing out names of folk that way, like one was keeping score at a darts match. Some sort of lunatic tally." Purbright, seated in his chair with fingers lightly steepled, gave no immediate reply. He had turned a page at random and was examining the handwriting, small, measured, and faintly old-fashioned, each entry aligned as though ruled with invisible precision. There was no commentary, merely the bare facts, a name, an age, a date of death, and sometimes, in the neatest of brackets, a location. At length, Purbright murmured, "There is comfort, Sergeant, in neatness. Even the untidier impulses of mankind may sometimes be pressed into orderly lines." Love gave a doubtful grunt. "If you mean murder, sir, it wouldn't surprise me." Purbright closed the book with a gentle pat. "Nor me, Sergeant, but speculation ahead of breakfast is an imprudent business. Let us consider what we have. A ledger of the dead, delivered anonymously, to a librarian who can hardly be accused of levity in such matters. Word of the ledger's arrival had already furnished the town with its own theories. The Flaxborough Citizen, not a newspaper inclined to forbearance in the face of gossip, printed a brief but prominently placed note, "Library Curiosity under Police Review." The article added that sources close to civic offices believed the ledger might relate to old parish records misplaced during some forgotten reorganization. This explanation satisfied no one. At the Crown and Anchor public house, the evening trade surged with customers whose thirst was sharpened by conjecture. Several regulars proposed that the ledger had been compiled by a secret society of amateur historians, known only to one another by coded coughs. Mr. Dobble, the retired sanitary inspector, declared it an attempt to frighten councillors who were too liberal in approving new building schemes. A quiet man in a corner, who happened to be the borough's rates collector, muttered something about blackmail, then refused to elaborate. Purbright, meanwhile, made a point of visiting the library once again in the afternoon. His arrival caused a small flurry. The cluster of readers at the periodicals desk leaned with audible disappointment when they saw that he carried nothing resembling the ledger. Missy Gorse received him with her usual mixture of frost and rectitude. She stood behind the main counter, hands folded like a monument to cataloguing. "I should like to know, Inspector," she said, "whether the volume will be returned to us in due course. It is not part of our stock, certainly, but I cannot condone the removal of items that may have some bearing upon local history." Purbright inclined his head. "We shall return it as soon as we are able to determine its, shall we say, provenance. You would not wish it to be the object of unhealthy curiosity?"
"Curiosity," Miss Gorse replied, "is not unhealthy."
"It is the foundation of reading. What is unhealthy is the sensation people are intent on attaching to it." "Quite so," Purbright said with a mild smile. "You have not, I trust, received any inquiries of a more pressing kind?" Miss Gorse stiffened. "If you mean insinuations, yes. The mayor's secretary telephoned this morning to ask whether any of the councillors' names were in the book. I informed him that such questions are beneath the dignity of a cultural institution." The inspector's eyebrows twitched with the faintest amusement. He thanked her for her vigilance, left her braced for further incursions, and departed to conduct his inquiries elsewhere. Later that evening, Sergeant Love brought him a list compiled after comparing the ledger entries with the borough's death registers. Most matched, though in several cases the ledger gave details absent from official records, not merely that a person had died, but precisely where. In a drawing room, on a back staircase, in the bath. Love spread the sheets across the desk. "Someone's gone to a deal of trouble, sir. It isn't just copying.
They've been watching, keeping tabs."
Look at this. Mrs. Froggatt 3 years ago recorded as found behind scullery door. Our register just says natural causes. Who'd write that sort of thing unless they'd seen it?" Purbright regarded the list in silence, then leaned back. Observant neighbours, Sergeant, are an inevitable feature of small communities. The question is whether our chronicler was merely a neighbour or something rather more intimate. As the night drew on, Flaxborough's imaginations grew ever more fertile. By the time the lamps were extinguished along High Street, the ledger had been transformed in the collective mind from a peculiar notebook to a dark oracle that might predict the next funeral. It was whispered that names yet living were inscribed in its final pages. The following morning, a deputation of townsfolk appeared at the police station. They were led by Mrs. Wivton, the mayor's wife, who carried herself with the indignation of one whose social standing entitled her to instant reassurance. "Inspector," she declared upon being shown into his office, "the public demand to know whether this ledger contains their names. People are quite unsettled. The wives of respectable tradesmen are refusing to sleep. In my own household, the servants insist on keeping lights burning. This cannot be allowed to continue." Purbright listened with attentive gravity, hands folded on the desk. "Madame, I quite understand the disquiet, yet I must beg your patience. To reveal the contents prematurely would serve only to magnify alarm." Mrs. Wivton pursed her lips. "Then may I ask, Inspector, whether the names therein are exclusively of persons already departed?" "Thus far," Purbright said after a thoughtful pause, "that would appear to be the case." The mayor's wife looked momentarily appeased, though it was plain that appeasement was a condition she found distasteful. With a curt nod, she withdrew, leaving behind the faint perfume of indignation. As Purbright returned to his paperwork, he reflected that the ledger was less a book than a mirror, casting back upon the town its own preoccupations with status.
"Memory," and the morbid delight of being unsettled.
He knew enough of Flaxborough to recognize that whatever truth lay behind the ledger's creation, it would be bound with threads of vanity, secrecy, and the eternal anxiety of reputation. For now, he allowed the volume to remain where it was, a silent presence upon his desk, waiting for the next hand that sought to explain itself through neat lines of ink. And, somewhere in Flaxborough, whether in a parlour, a vestry, or the quiet of an upper room, someone knew that their curious account of the dead had ceased to be private. That knowledge, Purbright reasoned, was unlikely to remain without consequence. By the third day, the ledger had ceased to be merely a curiosity and had become a local certainty, as solid and indisputable as the price of coal or the lateness of the buses. Everyone now spoke of it not as a singular object, but as a phenomenon like weather. The butcher's boy claimed it listed all those who had died, suspicious-like, over the last 20 years. The hairdresser assured her clients it was a grim family Bible, compiled by an ancestor bent on shameful revelations. Even the vicar, cornered after morning prayers, admitted to a parishioner that he could not say whether the book was of sacramental, historical, or purely scandalous origin. Inspector Purbright, meanwhile, moved with his customary mildness between this swelling sea of conjecture and the quiet persistence of fact. The ledger remained under lock at the police station, though he spent long moments in its company, turning pages not hurriedly, but with the reflective patience of a man listening for a voice. He noticed peculiarities. The order was not chronological as with parish records, but grouped almost whimsically. A man who had died in 1936 might be followed by a woman from 1954, then by a child from the previous spring. Yet the handwriting was consistent, each entry as carefully inscribed as the last. Detective Sergeant Love entered with an expression that balanced both zeal and apprehension. "Sir, I've spoken with the registrar's office again. They confirm that none of these details, where the bodies were found, what they were doing at the time, appear in official documents. Someone's gone to the trouble of adding them in." Purbright gave a slow nod. "The trouble, Sergeant, is not inconsiderable. To know that Mrs. Froggatt collapsed behind her scullery door, one must either have been in the scullery or have had an intimate correspondent who was," Love frowned, rubbing the side of his nose as though smoothing down a thought. "So you mean whoever wrote this wasn't just copying records? They were collecting stories, observations, recollections, confidences," Purbright murmured. "Flaxborough is rich in those commodities. The difficulty lies not in obtaining them, but in choosing which to believe." The sergeant shifted uneasily. "It still feels wrong, sir, writing down deaths like football scores. Morbid, if not criminal." "Perhaps not criminal in itself," Purbright said, rising to his feet with unhurried ease. "But men and women are not usually inclined to go to such lengths without reason. Shall we see whether reason resides in the library staff?" They walked the short distance to the municipal library. Outside, the autumn afternoon hung heavy, leaves tumbling in desultory spirals that seemed to mock the earnest steps of those hurrying through the square. The library's stone frontage loomed with its usual sternness, though inside the air was thick with the mild chaos of an institution under siege by gossip. Readers hovered near the front desk, borrowing books they had no intention of reading, merely to linger and whisper. Miss Edith Gorse stood guard with the stiff poise of a woman who had long since expected civilization to collapse, and was grimly satisfied to be proven right. Her junior assistant, a timid young man called Pottle, busied himself with stamping returns, each thump sounding like a small protest against disorder. Purbright greeted them politely. "Miss Gorse, Mr. Pottle, you will forgive the intrusion. I should like to ask a few questions about the delivery that startled your society the other evening." Miss Gorse pursed her lips regarding him as though he were a late return himself. "We have already answered inquiries, Inspector. The volume was found in the return receptacle after hours. It bore no identifying marks. That is the full extent of our knowledge. Still," Purbright continued, Undisturbed, you or your staff may have noticed who last approached the receptacle, or behaved oddly in the vicinity. Pottle blinked nervously.
Well, sir, if I might say, there was Mr. Clixby, the antiquarian bookseller.
He brings in parcels now and again, donations of old sermons or pamphlets. He said last week he'd dropped something off. Could be coincidence? But he does like to surprise us, Miss Gorse snapped. Mr. Pottle, do refrain from speculation. On the contrary, Purbright said kindly, speculation is most helpful when labelled as such. Mr. Clixby, yes.
I know him, Love frowned.
The chap with the shop down by the canal, sir? The one that smells of glue and dust? Same, Purbright confirmed. He inclined his head to Miss Gorse and withdrew, leaving her to preserve order among the curious. The shop of Arthur Clixby was indeed an aromatic shrine to dishevelled knowledge. Shelves groaned under the weight of foxed volumes, pamphlets no one had wanted in their first year of printing, and the detritus of forgotten publishing ventures. Clixby himself emerged from behind a tottering stack of railway timetables, his round spectacles magnifying eyes that conveyed both anxiety and opportunism. Inspector, a pleasure. Something of interest for the borough library, was it? Possibly, Purbright said. A ledger found amongst returned books. The kind of thing one might encounter in the darker corners of bibliophilia. Would you know anything of it? Clixby's hands fluttered like nervous birds.
A ledger, you say? Deaths recorded?
Good heavens, no. I deal in catalogues, indexes, inventories, but not that sort of thing. Though I did come across a collection of mortuary notices once. Morbid little things printed on crepe paper.
Can't say they sold. Purbright regarded him with steady mildness.
Mr. Pottle mentioned you had promised to drop off some volumes. Old sermons, Inspector, nothing more sinister than the occasional thunder against gin.
I assure you, if I had come across a book of the kind you describe, I should have considered it unfit for donation.
Scarcely good for trade either. The inspector gave a small bow. Thank you, Mr. Clixby. One cannot be too careful with the written word. It has a way of finding readers it was never intended for. They left the shop with the faint scent of mildew clinging to their coats. Love, who had observed Clixby's twitching manner, muttered, "If he didn't drop it off, I'll eat his paste pot." Purbright smiled faintly. And let us not demand proof too soon. Appetite can be a dangerous motivator. That evening, alone in his office, Purbright returned to the ledger. His finger lingered on a name, Jonathan Ray, deceased 6 months prior, age 52. Next to the date, the ledger bore a curious annotation. In the cellar, beside the preserving jars. The official record listed simply heart failure. Purbright remembered the case, a grocer's assistant, stout of build, unremarkable in habits, found collapsed in his own cellar. Nothing untoward had been suggested, yet here, in this anonymous chronicle, was a detail no register would note. He closed the book, sat back, and allowed his thoughts to hover, not rushing to conclusions, but gathering them like mist before dawn. Across town, the gossip thickened. The widow Mrs. Fosdyke assured her bridge partners that the ledger named 2 people who had not yet died. The greengrocer Shipley swore he knew whose handwriting it was, but refused to say until asked formally. And somewhere behind a darkened window, the true author of the ledger might well have been listening, wondering how long it would be before their neat lines of ink drew the attention they deserved, or feared. Inspector Purbright, patient as ever, resolved that tomorrow he would visit the home of Jonathan Ray's widow, not to accuse, not even to question directly, but to listen. For Flaxborough's truths, he knew, were rarely shouted. They were whispered, hinted, wrapped in propriety and served with tea. And it was only by listening, endlessly listening, that one might learn who in the town had taken to filing away corpses as though they were books waiting to be borrowed. Inspector Purbright presented himself the next morning at the residence of Mrs. Ray, widow of the grocer's assistant, whose cellar had earned a curious mention in the ledger. The small terraced house stood at the end of a narrow street, its curtains drawn with the air of permanent mourning. The garden, though neat, had the resigned look of a place maintained more for the neighbour's eyes than for its occupant's pleasure. Mrs. Ray received him in a parlour so dim that Purbright felt obliged to pause and let his eyes adjust. She was a woman of middle years, compact in stature, her expression oscillating between wariness and faint relief at having company. She offered tea at once, which Purbright accepted, and then seated herself upright on the edge of a chair,
hands folded tightly in her lap. "You'll forgive me?"
"Inspector," she began, "but I can't imagine what further there is to say. My husband died of his heart. That was the end of it." Purbright inclined his head in agreement. "Quite so, Mrs. Ray. The register says as much. Still, you must indulge me. It is sometimes useful, in the business of tidying up records, to hear from those nearest." The widow seemed reassured by the phrasing, though her fingers still twined restlessly. "He was down in the cellar."
"I'd sent him for some jars."
"It was silly of me."
"I could have gone myself."
But he insisted.
"Always did like to prove he was useful."
"He called up something about a jam that had gone mouldy and then—" Her voice faltered. "I went down and found him on the floor. Doctor said it was his heart." "Dr. Lambert?" Purbright asked gently. She nodded. "He was very kind, arranged everything really, said it was mercifully quick." Purbright sipped his tea, his expression sympathetic, but inwardly noting the steadiness with which she recounted her story. "And there was no suggestion of anything unusual?"
"No visitors that day, no disturbances?"
Mrs. Ray shook her head.
"None. Jonathan was a steady man, Inspector."
"He liked his tea strong, his crossword in the evenings, and that was all. If you're asking whether he had enemies, I can't imagine it." The inspector allowed a pause to linger, then set his cup gently on its saucer.
"Thank you, Mrs. Ray. Forgive me for troubling you."
"There is a peculiar book in circulation that has mentioned your husband's passing in rather more detail than usual."
"I thought it only right to verify," her brow furrowed. "A book? What sort of book?"
Purbright's voice remained mild. "A ledger of deaths, compiled by someone unknown. It recorded your husband as having died beside the preserving jars in the cellar. That, of course, is accurate."
"But not the sort of fact one expects to find written down for posterity." Mrs. Ray's hands tightened in her lap.
"Who would write such a thing?"
"And why?"
"That," Purbright said with the faintest of smiles, "is what we hope to learn." He rose, thanked her, and declined further tea. As he left, he noticed her gaze following him with more curiosity than grief. It was as though the intrusion of the ledger into her settled narrative had reawakened her own doubts. Doubts she had been careful not to entertain until the policeman's presence gave her permission. Back at the station, Sergeant Love was waiting with fresh agitation.
"Sir, more folk have been asking to see that ledger."
Some of them near demanded it. I had to turn away Shipley, the greengrocer. He was muttering that he'd sue the council if his mother's name had been put in there, and Mrs. Ballum threatened to write to the Home Secretary. "Let us not trouble the Home Secretary just yet," Purbright replied. "But it is becoming clear the ledger was not written for the town's benefit. It was meant for someone's private satisfaction. That it has emerged into public view is the accident." Love frowned. "Private satisfaction?"
"Doesn't sound right, sir."
"Writing down the exact place and time people died. It's more like keeping trophies." Purbright considered this with a slow nod. "An apt word, Sergeant. Let us keep it in mind." That afternoon he paid another visit, this time to Dr. Lambert. The physician received him in his surgery, where the smell of antiseptic mingled oddly with the aroma of overbrewed coffee. Lambert was a tidy man with a beard trimmed as if by ruler, his eyes sharp but not unkind. "Ah, Inspector," he said, "come to quiz me about poor Ray, I suppose. Sad case, though not unexpected. His heart was weak for years. I warned him often enough. I don't doubt your judgment, Doctor," Purbright replied smoothly. "It is not the cause of death I question, but the observation of it. The deceased was found in his cellar by the preserving jars, according to a certain account. That struck me as detail more likely to come from a doctor than a neighbour." Lambert looked mildly affronted.
I've never written such a thing, Inspector.
My notes are for the coroner alone. Whoever produced that book has either copied from records they should not have seen, or
invented.
And if invented, then with alarming accuracy. Purbright inclined his head, letting the silence invite further comment. The doctor cleared his throat. I have had patients, well, you must know it yourself, who take a queer pride in watching others, in noting what happens around them. There are women in this town who could tell you precisely which curtain was drawn in which window on a Tuesday afternoon. If you ask me, this ledger is the work of such a person taken to excess. The inspector smiled faintly. A natural historian of mortality, perhaps. Thank you, Doctor. By the time Purbright returned to the station, dusk was settling. The gas lamps flickered into life along the high street, and the pubs began filling with townsfolk, keen to turn the day's rumours into the evening's certainties. Within an hour, the ledger had been credited with predicting 3 imminent deaths, naming an alderman's mistress, and proving the town clerk had once fainted in the public baths. In his office, Purbright turned the pages again. He paused at another name, Cyril Shipman, a retired railway porter who had died the previous year. The ledger recorded, collapsed on the 10:14 platform, waiting for a train that never arrived. A touch of irony in the phrasing suggested the compiler possessed a dry humour, not merely a factual impulse. That hint of humour, Purbright reflected, might be as telling as the accuracy. Whoever wrote this was not only a recorder but a commentator, one who relished the small ironies of death. It was no cold bureaucrat, no clerk. It was someone with a sense of the theatrical, albeit restrained to ink and paper. The inspector closed the book and sat quietly, his mind working as it always did, slowly, politely, as though asking permission of each thought before admitting it. There were threads forming now, the precise detail of observation, the relish in phrase, the insistence on accuracy. Someone in Flaxborough, most likely a person long tolerated as eccentric, had chosen to make a private theatre of the town's mortality. And now that theatre had gained an audience, it was never meant to have. Purbright rose, switched off the desk lamp, and allowed himself a quiet smile. Tomorrow, he decided, he would speak again with Miss Gorse. A librarian, after all, knew more about her patrons than they supposed. She might not have seen who deposited the ledger, but she would certainly know who had the habits of recording, collecting, and filing with the precision the book displayed. And so the inspector stepped out into the night. The ledger locked once more in his desk, while across Flaxborough curtains were drawn. Teacups rattled and conversations carried on in low tones about who might be next to be written into the town's strangest catalogue. Mrs. Cattermole's vehement conviction that a library assistant was responsible for all ills, whether overdue books, misplaced pamphlets, or, now, a corpse, lingered in Purbright's thoughts long after she had clattered away from the police station, her umbrella threatening pedestrians who strayed too near. It was not that Purbright believed her accusation. Indeed, he entertained it with the same indulgent patience he might show to a child's insistence that thunder was caused by the shifting of Cloud's furniture. What struck him more was the alacrity with which suspicion in Flaxborough could fasten itself upon the nearest, least formidable figure. That Mrs. Beckwith's name should rise so promptly suggested less of reason than of habit. He left the station that evening with the mist softening the town's lamps and lending the high street a theatrical air,
as though it were a stage between performances.
Shopkeepers were dragging shutters closed with that air of faint martyrdom peculiar to tradesmen obliged to make a living. Purbright walked slowly, nodding here and there, his thoughts drifting not to corpses, but to cupboards, and to the curious loyalty of townsfolk towards places in which they stored not only things, but secrets. The library, he decided, must be revisited, though perhaps not by official inquiry alone. The next morning, before the mist had quite surrendered to daylight, he called at the library again. The staff moved about with strained cheerfulness, like actors who had been told the play was to continue despite the disappearance of the leading man. Mrs. Beckwith, pale but brisk, directed a junior assistant towards the periodicals shelf, while another attempted with visible discomfort to instruct a reader in the workings of the microfilm machine. Purbright's arrival was greeted with a hush that fell not from fear, but from eagerness. It was as though the mere presence of authority could bring order to the muddle of imagination, gossip,
and dread. Mrs. Beckwith approached him with a kind of dignified defensiveness. "Inspector."
"You will be pleased to know we have already checked every cupboard this morning," she said, as though preemptively scolding him for suspecting her of negligence. "We even examined the lost property box."
"Only a single glove and a child's reading token were found." Purbright bowed his head gravely.
"Most commendable thoroughness, madam. Though you will forgive me if I look round myself. An inspector like a child is not content unless he sees with his own eyes." As he drifted through the aisles, Purbright observed more closely the geography of the place. It struck him that the library, like the town itself, was an assemblage of concealed corners and overlooked recesses. Behind the fiction shelves lay a narrow corridor leading to a storeroom stacked with outdated encyclopedias awaiting disposal. The reference section, too, contained a stout chest in which back issues of the Flaxborough Chronicle were kept, its lid warped so that it closed with difficulty. The librarian's tour, reluctantly offered, revealed nothing more sinister than a broken umbrella stand and a faint smell of varnish. Still, Purbright noticed the unease with which certain assistants avoided particular corners, and the too ready smiles offered when he lingered near them on leaving. He paused at the counter, where Mrs. Beckwith was stamping dates into a pile of novels. "Tell me," he said, "did anyone in particular have access to these cupboards, aside from staff?" She frowned. "Occasionally the porter, Mr. Groom, helps to shift heavier boxes. But otherwise, no. The public would hardly be trusted near our archives." "Mr. Groom," Purbright repeated, with the air of a man testing a word for its sound rather than its meaning. "Is he long in your service?"
4 years, a widower, diligent, if somewhat slow." She added the last remark with the reluctant satisfaction of one who could not resist inserting a caveat. By the time Purbright returned to the station,
he had assembled a small collection of such remarks from various citizens. Mr. Groom, it appeared, was viewed by some as a harmless soul, by others as a silent and possibly brooding one. The divergence of opinion itself interested Purbright more than the man's character, for he knew Flaxborough's judgments were rarely founded on fact, but they often pointed towards the truth indirectly, like the wind-blown veering of smoke that betrays a fire's position. At noon, Sergeant Love knocked at the inspector's door with the conscientious air of one who has tidied not only his papers, but his thoughts. "Sir," he began, "about the deceased. We've had preliminary details. Male, between 50 and 60.
No identification yet."
"No obvious wounds." "No," murmured Purbright. "The library is not a place for wounds."
"At least not the visible kind." Love, who had never quite mastered the art of deciphering Purbright's remarks, continued earnestly.
"The pathologist suggests death occurred within 48 hours prior to discovery. Heart failure is not ruled out. Poison neither, of course." "It's too early." Purbright looked thoughtfully at his sergeant. "Would you be good enough, Love, to inquire discreetly whether any gentlemen of middle years have been reported missing in the last week? We may discover for once that absence has been noticed." Love saluted the request with solemnity, as though it involved deep sacrifice on his part, and withdrew. Meanwhile, news of the corpse had percolated through the town with a rapidity which would have embarrassed a more populous centre. At the butcher's, speculation flourished between customers waiting for their chops. At the hairdresser's, the corpse's alleged identity changed 3 times in the space of a morning. By tea-time, a general consensus had been reached that the body was none other than Mr. Carter, an unpopular tax collector who, inconveniently, was seen shortly afterwards purchasing sausages. The gossip, Purbright reflected that evening, was less remarkable for its accuracy than for its instinct. In seizing upon certain names, the town betrayed those it least trusted, those upon whom suspicion sat most comfortably. He made a note of these names, not because he believed them guilty, but because guilt in Flaxborough often hid where trust was thinnest. 2 days later, the investigation acquired a sharper edge. A clerk at the borough offices, rummaging for old property records, came upon a gap in the files. Entire ledgers from the early 1950s had vanished, those concerning leases of municipal buildings. The discovery might have been dismissed as carelessness, had not one of the missing volumes been rumoured to contain notes about the very library in question. When Purbright received the report, he closed his eyes briefly as though indulging a nap, then said, "I think, love, that our corpse was not merely resting. He was tidily filed away like one of those documents. The question is whether he was mislaid or deliberately catalogued out of sight." Love blinked. "Do you mean someone killed him to do with the library's records, sir?" Purbright sighed. "It is the habit of mankind to leave motives lying about like umbrellas. Some are meant to be picked up, others to be trodden on. We shall see which this one is, that evening." As darkness settled over Flaxborough and the lamps once more wore their misty halos, Purbright sat at his desk making a list of those who might have cause to meddle with municipal records, councillors with property interests, developers eager for sites, and officials with something to conceal, all featured in quiet rows of ink. Beneath them he wrote a single additional name, Groom, library porter, not because he suspected him greatly, but because, in the economy of secrets, the humblest hand often turned the key. The town, meanwhile, enjoyed its new scandal with the relish of diners presented with a dish both exotic and slightly indigestible. Mrs. Cattermole now declared loudly that she had seen the porter carrying suspicious bundles after dark. Others whispered that Mrs. Beckwith had argued with an unknown man in the reading room. Through it all, Purbright walked his measured course, listening more than speaking, storing away fragments of talk as a squirrel does nuts. He knew the truth would come, not in the crash of revelation, but in the quiet shift of a word, the faltering of a voice, or the misplacement of something apparently trivial. And as he extinguished his lamp that night, he thought again of cupboards, of files, and of the curious human tendency to put away not only books, but bodies when they became inconvenient. The discovery of the missing municipal ledgers hung in the air like the faint tang of damp plaster in an old house, subtle, persistent, and not easily dismissed. In Flaxborough, omissions were often as telling as inclusions. If the town records could mislay themselves, then a corpse could hardly be expected to do better. Purbright entertained the thought with his usual dry patience as he leaned back in his chair, his eyes half closed, while Sergeant Love shifted restlessly before the desk as though standing guard over invisible truths. "We've checked with the borough clerk, sir," Love announced, clutching his notebook with solemn care. "He swears those ledgers were all accounted for 6 months ago during an audit. Says they could only have been taken deliberately." "Did he," Purbright murmured, "express any regret, sorrow, or indeed faint embarrassment at their disappearance?"
Love considered.
"Not exactly, sir." More relief. He seemed glad to have something definite to complain about. "That," said Purbright, "is the instinct of a man who has grown too accustomed to dreariness. The sudden absence of a file provides him with something approaching colour in life." He smiled thinly. "Nevertheless, we must treat the matter seriously. If a corpse and a set of ledgers disappear together, we must suppose they have exchanged confidences." Love scratched his head. "You don't mean the body was connected with the library records, sir?" Purbright's eyes opened. "I mean only that both were tidied away in cupboards. And cupboards, Sergeant, are rarely innocent." The sergeant, accustomed to such oracular remarks, wrote nothing down, but looked suitably impressed. By the next day, the gossip had acquired new nourishment. It was said in the High Street that the dead man had been a government inspector, dispatched to examine Flaxborough's civic finances. At the post office counter, a queue of women elaborated the tale until he became a foreign spy sent to infiltrate the county council. By supper time, he had been transformed again into an escaped convict who had hidden among the encyclopedias until overcome by guilt. In this last form, the rumour even reached Purbright, carried in by Sergeant Love with the faintly apologetic air of a man offering a damaged umbrella. "They say, sir, he might have been some sort of criminal on the run." Purbright looked up from his papers. Flaxborough, Love, is not the natural habitat of desperados. They would find our civic library too forbidding a wilderness. Still, the possibility that the dead man was an outsider did occupy his thoughts. If he were a stranger, how had he gained access to the hidden recesses of the library? If not, then why had no one yet missed him? On Thursday morning, Purbright resolved to confront Mr. Groom, the library porter. He found him in the yard behind the library, stacking boxes with the slowness of one who believed excessive energy an insult to gravity. Groom was a short, broad man with shoulders that sloped in resignation and eyes that had the downcast wariness of a dog too often told to move along. "Good morning, Mr. Groom," Purbright began cheerfully. "I hope you are not overtaxed by this sudden demand for tidiness." Groom wiped his hands on his apron and gave a small shrug. "Always tidying, sir."
Always something put where it oughtn't to be. Purbright regarded him mildly. "Indeed, it seems even people may be mislaid."
"You were the one who discovered our unfortunate gentleman in the cupboard, I believe?" The porter shifted, his boot scraping the cobbles.
"Yes, sir. I was putting away some pamphlets."
Opened the door, and there he was. "You had not noticed anything unusual before? Smells, noises, draughts, or the like?" "No, sir. Nothing. Just as usual." His eyes darted momentarily towards the rear gate, then back down. Purbright did not pursue the look, but filed it away quietly. "You have been here 4 years, I understand. A good many cupboards must have passed under your care." "Yes, sir," Groom said with a small, humourless chuckle. "You'd be surprised what gets left behind."
"Old sandwiches, umbrellas, even a fox once. Stuffed, of course. Never a man, though." Purbright thanked him politely and left him to his boxes,
though he carried away the distinct impression that Groom's humour, such as it was, had been rehearsed rather than spontaneous. That afternoon, Love reported that the dead man had finally been identified. A clerk in a nearby town recognized him as Mr. Lionel Hargreaves, a retired solicitor who had recently been engaged in advising several councils on property matters. He had, it seemed, been in Flaxborough only a fortnight, lodging at a modest boarding house on the edge of town. Purbright received the news with a slow nod. "A solicitor, you say? Then our missing ledgers may indeed have had a voice before they were silenced." "Do you think he was killed because of something in those records, sir?" Love asked eagerly. "Let us say," replied Purbright, "that his presence was less convenient to some than his absence. What interests me more is why, if he were merely to be disposed of, he was placed in the library cupboard rather than elsewhere. Murderers seldom choose locations with lending hours." By evening, Flaxborough had woven the identity of Lionel Hargreaves into its tapestry of conjecture. Some recalled with sudden clarity having seen him strolling the high street, though their descriptions varied so widely as to suggest several different men. Mrs. Cattermole was overheard declaring that she had once been overcharged by a solicitor, and that this was clearly the same man come back to torment her. At the police station, Purbright drafted a letter to the Borough Council, requesting a list of all leases and contracts handled in the early 1950s. He wrote it in his customary neat hand, pausing occasionally as though composing a polite invitation rather than a demand. Love, watching him, marvelled not for the first time at the inspector's patience. "Sir," he ventured, "do you ever think it strange how people will risk so much over bits of paper?" Purbright placed his pen down. "Not at all, Love. In Flaxborough, paper is our chief weapon. With a signature, one man can dispossess another of a farm, a shop, or a home. It is therefore no surprise that paper occasionally exacts a corpse. Love digested this in silence, then nodded solemnly, as if filing it under general wisdom. The following morning brought a new disturbance. The boarding house where Hargreaves had lodged reported that one of his suitcases had vanished from the storeroom. The landlady, Mrs. Peebles, stout and precise, insisted she had last seen it 2 days before his death. A brown case, rather shabby, with brass corners. It was not much to look at, but he kept it locked. Purbright examined the storeroom himself. It was narrow, dusty, and lined with shelves bearing the detritus of long-term tenants, trunks, hat boxes, and the occasional forgotten toy. The absence of the brown case was evident only to those who had known it was there. Back at the station, Purbright turned the matter over in his mind. The disappearance of ledgers from the council, a solicitor known for property matters and now a missing suitcase, it began to form the outline of something less accidental than deliberate. Yet the shape of it remained concealed, like a figure behind frosted glass. He stood at his office window, gazing out over the marketplace where townsfolk moved about their errands, with the contented fretfulness of people who prefer small disturbances to great ones. Somewhere among them, he reflected, was someone who had balanced the weight of secrecy against the inconvenience of a body, and decided that a library cupboard was the proper place for concealment. And with that thought, Purbright determined that the time was nearing for a gentle but pointed question or two, questions to be placed, as one might lay mouse-traps in a pantry, with no expectation of noise but a quiet certainty of capture. The disappearance of Lionel Hargreaves's suitcase gave to the investigation a sharper edge, for while a man may be misplaced by mischance, luggage very seldom vanishes of its own accord. Suitcases, Purbright reflected, were like consciences. They tended to follow their owners and contain what could not be safely discarded. He and Sergeant Love called once more upon Mrs. Peebles, the boarding-house landlady, who received them in a parlour stiff with antimacassars and the faint odour of boiled cabbage that had seeped permanently into the wallpaper. She was a woman of ample proportions and formidable certainty, and her account of events was given with all the emphasis of one accustomed to triumph in disputes about laundry or rent arrears. "I kept his things together in the storeroom," she declared, "because he said he wouldn't need them every day. That case, Inspector, was heavy. You could see from the way he handled it he didn't want anyone prying. Brass corners and a lock. Not like the usual tap my lodgers drag in." "And when, madam?" Purbright asked gently. "Did you last actually see the case yourself?" "2 mornings before he went missing. I'd gone in to fetch a mop. It was there, on the lower shelf." "And since then," Purbright continued, "you have not noticed anyone carrying it out?" Mrs. Peebles drew herself up. "Inspector, if anyone had marched through my hallway with a suitcase that size, I should have noticed. My eyesight may be dim for fine print, but not for luggage." Purbright bowed slightly. "Of course. You are quite right. It is only that suitcases sometimes take quieter exits than hallways. A window, for example." The landlady blinked at him with affronted astonishment, as though the very suggestion that her establishment contained such treachery to domestic order was unpardonable. As they took their leave, Love remarked in a low voice, "If it was stolen, sir, it must have been while she was out." "Or by someone she trusted enough not to watch," Purbright nodded. "The more so if the thief was confident that no one would later connect him with the dead man. A suitcase is easier to explain away than a corpse." That evening the inspector received a visit in his office from Councillor Harcourt, a man whose florid complexion suggested habitual indignation rather than good cheer. He began without preamble. "Inspector, I must protest at the suggestion that borough records have been tampered with. It is a slur upon the administration of this town." Purbright folded his hands. "I have not suggested it, Councillor. I have merely observed that ledgers are missing." Harcourt flushed more deeply. "Records are misplaced, misfiled. It happens in every office."
To imply, Purbright's voice was calm, almost soothing.
"The ledgers in question, Councillor, are from the early 1950s. That was the period, was it not, when the library extension was built?" Yes, yes, a trifling matter of bricks and mortar. Yet a solicitor has been found dead in the library cupboard. A solicitor known to be examining property records. One might almost believe, if one were fanciful, that the two matters were linked. Harcourt shifted in his seat, his earlier bluster curdling into watchfulness. Well, Inspector, I can't help what people choose to believe. My only concern is that no unnecessary scandal should attach itself to the council. Of course, Purbright replied gently. Scandal is so often unnecessary, yet it does have a way of arriving, like rain at a garden party. After Harcourt departed, leaving behind the faint impression of having threatened without quite daring to, Purbright remained at his desk in thought. He knew the man's concern for appearances was genuine, but it was not appearances alone that produced such defensiveness. Somewhere behind the councillor's indignation lay the unease of one who knew the dead solicitor's interest was more than casual. 2 days later, a small stir arose in town when the suitcase was recovered. It had been found abandoned at the railway station, wedged behind a trolley in the parcels room. The lock had been broken. Inside were papers, bundles of correspondence, and notes in Lionel Hargreaves's neat, lawyerly hand. Among them, Purbright discovered several references to Library Lease 1953 and the names of local businessmen who had since become figures of quiet prosperity. One in particular caught his eye, Swithin Bloxham, owner of a row of properties let at profitable rates. In the early 50s, it seemed, Bloxham had been involved in the transfer of a municipal site, at terms so favourable as to invite suspicion of manipulation. That evening, Purbright sat in his office, the suitcase open before him, while Sergeant Love hovered in respectful silence. Notice.
Love, the inspector murmured. How often prosperity grows from the soil of silence.
What Mr. Hargreaves unearthed was perhaps not a crime of violence, but of convenience, one that men prefer left decently buried in paper rather than unearthed in flesh. Love bent over the documents, frowning. Do you think Bloxham might have killed him, sir? Purbright shook his head slowly. It would be rash to conclude so quickly, but he may have been among those who considered the past best left unexamined. The following day, Purbright paid a visit to Mr. Bloxham, whose offices occupied a solid brick building with the complacent air of a business that had grown fat upon rent. Bloxham himself was a lean, sandy-haired man with a manner that combined affability with vigilance. "Inspector, a pleasure," he said, motioning Purbright to a chair. "I hear you've had quite the puzzle on your hands. Terrible business."
A body in the library, what will people say?
"They have said a good deal already," Purbright observed, most of it more imaginative than accurate. "But what interests me, Mr. Bloxham, is whether you happen to know Mr. Lionel Hargreaves." Bloxham's smile faltered only a fraction. "Hargreaves?"
Oh, yes, yes.
"Met him years ago briefly. Can't say I knew him."
Why do you ask?
He had among his papers certain notes regarding the library lease of 1953. Your name appeared. The man gave a laugh. Too sharp, too quick.
Ah, well, I may have been peripherally involved.
Property dealings, you know.
Old business.
Hardly worth dredging up now. Purbright inclined his head. Of course, old business seldom improves with exposure to the air. Still, it is curious that a solicitor should travel here, inquire into such matters, and end by occupying a cupboard in the library. Bloxham's expression cooled.
Are you accusing me of something, Inspector?
Not at all, Purbright said gently. I merely observe. Accusations are the privilege of gossip. Observations are the burden of police. When Purbright left, he was convinced less of Bloxham's guilt than of his knowledge. The man's smoothness had cracked just enough to reveal that he knew precisely what Hargreaves had been about. That night, Purbright allowed himself a quiet reflection. Flaxborough was not a place of grand passions or dramatic crimes. Its sins were those of omission, concealment, and compromise. Yet, such sins, he knew, were no less capable of producing corpses. He returned to the suitcase, leafing once more through the solicitor's papers. One note in particular stood out, a reference to testimony from Groom. The porter's name, scrawled in Hargreaves's neat hand, sat like a quiet signpost amid the legal jargon. Purbright sat back, fingers steepled. Groom again. The silent man among the cupboards.
Perhaps not a killer, but a witness.
And in Flaxborough, witnesses had a way of being filed away as tidily as unwanted ledgers. With that thought, Purbright resolved that his next step must be to draw the porter out, not with accusation, but with the kind of gentle prodding that dislodges hidden things from dusty shelves. For in the soft shuffle of Groom's silences he felt certain lay a truth that someone had been desperate to lock away. The porter, Groom, was not a man easily extracted from his silences. When Purbright called at the library the following morning, he found him polishing a brass rail with the deliberate slowness of one determined that no task, however minor, should be thoughtlessly concluded. His back was bent, his sleeves rolled, and his eyes, when he raised them, held that dull watchfulness of one accustomed to being asked for answers he would prefer not to give. "Good morning, Mr. Groom," Purbright said lightly, as though they were meeting in the street by chance. "I hope the brass has done nothing to offend you." Groom gave a grunt that might have been amusement. "Keeps me occupied, sir. Always something wants polishing?" "Yes," said Purbright. "The world grows tarnished quickly."
I wonder if I might borrow a little of your time.
"I'm curious about a name that appeared in Mr. Hargreaves's papers, your own." The porter's hand stilled on the cloth. He looked down again at the rail, rubbing as though to erase not only its dullness, but the question itself. "Don't know why he'd write my name," he muttered. "Didn't hardly speak to him." "But you did speak?" Purbright asked gently. Groom hesitated. He asked about the old days.
About when the library was built.
Wanted to know who worked here then, who signed for what. I said I didn't know much. Purbright's voice was patient, almost kind. Yet he thought it worth noting you. Perhaps you knew more than you realized. The porter's shoulders shifted in a half shrug. Maybe I told him about things going missing back then. Tools, timber, boxes of stuff.
Thought it was just builders being builders.
He seemed interested. And what sort of things? Purbright inquired softly. Were in those boxes? Groom rubbed the brass rail until it squeaked.
Couldn't rightly say.
But I remember one had papers in it. Council stuff.
I was told to keep my nose out. Purbright regarded him with calm attentiveness. And who told you that?
The porter looked up then, a flicker of fear crossing his face. He opened his mouth, closed it, and bent again to his polishing. Doesn't matter, sir.
Long time ago, the inspector let the silence stretch.
Groom's reluctance was more eloquent than any confession. He knew something, enough to make him afraid even after 20 years. Later that day, Purbright returned to the station, where Sergeant Love awaited him with an air of earnest expectation. I've checked further into Hargreaves's background, sir. He'd been corresponding with several councils about irregular leases. Looks like he was gathering material for some kind of case. Maybe even planning a report to Whitehall, Purbright nodded. And in Flaxborough, irregular leases have a habit of growing regular with time. Our solicitor seems to have been digging in soil long since compacted. Love leaned forward. So Groom must have told him something worth writing down. Something dangerous. Quite so, Purbright said. And I suspect our porter's fear is less of what he remembers than of those who also remember. That evening, as Purbright walked through the market square, the town seemed to him unusually quiet, as though waiting. Shop windows reflected the last of the light, and the faint chime of the church clock echoed across the rooftops. He paused to observe the townsfolk passing by, men tipping their hats, women exchanging murmurs. Beneath their ordinariness lay the familiar undercurrent of calculation. Who had gained, who had lost, who might yet be found out. The following morning brought an unexpected visitor. Mrs. Beckwith, the head librarian, arrived at the station, her expression taut with indignation, overlaid with worry. She carried a small envelope which she placed on Purbright's desk with the air of a woman delivering poisoned fruit. "This," she announced, "was pushed under the library door last night."
No address, no signature.
"Just this." Inside was a scrap of paper bearing a single sentence, written in an uneven hand. "Tell Groom to keep his mouth shut or he'll join the solicitor." Love whistled low. That's a threat if ever I saw one. Purbright held the note delicately, as though weighing not just the words, but the intent behind them. Indeed, a threat written by someone for whom subtlety is an extravagance, yet it tells us what we already suspected, that Groom knows more than he admits, and that others believe him capable of talking. Mrs. Beckwith clasped her hands together tightly. "I won't have the library made into a den of criminals. It's a place of learning, Inspector, not a—" Purbright inclined his head gravely. "Quite so, madam, though it has proved, regrettably, a place of storage." After she left, Love asked, "Shall we put a man on Groom for protection?" Purbright considered. "Yes, but discreetly. If our friends believe him to be guarded, they may seek some subtler means of silencing him. Better that we allow them the confidence to make a mistake under watchful eyes." So it was arranged that Groom should be observed quietly, though he himself remained unaware of it. Days passed with no attempt upon him, though his manner grew more withdrawn, as if the threat, though unseen, pressed against him like damp air. Meanwhile, Purbright continued his inquiries among those connected with the Council of the 1950s. Old names surfaced, councillors long retired, builders now respectable tradesmen, clerks who had since prospered or disappeared. The common thread was a silence too consistent to be accidental. No one remembered details of the library extension. No one could account for why the records had been so conveniently lost. One evening, Sergeant Love brought word that Bloxham had been seen visiting Groom in the yard behind the library. Their exchange had been brief, their faces strained. Did they quarrel? Purbright asked. "No, sir. But Groom looked nervous. And Bloxham, well—"
He looked like a man delivering instructions. Purbright smiled faintly.
"Then we are approaching the heart of our cupboard. Bloxham fears what Groom knows, and Groom fears what Bloxham may do. Between the two lies our unfortunate solicitor, filed away for neatness." Love frowned.
"Do you think Bloxham killed him?"
The inspector leaned back in his chair, his hands steepled.
"Perhaps."
"Or perhaps he merely pointed out to another that a solicitor prying into leases is as troublesome as a moth in the curtains. In Flaxborough, Sergeant, guilt is often a communal affair, spread thin so no one's slice is indigestible." As the week drew to a close, Purbright resolved that the time had come to unsettle the balance. He would need to test not only Groom's loyalty to silence, but also the determination of those who wished to preserve it. He began with a simple device. An invitation. A polite note was sent to Mr. Bloxham, requesting his presence at the police station for clarification of certain historical matters. The phrasing was innocuous, the effect less so. Word spread quickly. By the time Bloxham appeared, the town was already abuzz with speculation. Bloxham arrived in a suit of understated expense, his smile tight but serviceable. Purbright welcomed him with unfailing courtesy, offering tea before placing on the desk the note that had threatened Groom. "I thought you might recognize the handwriting," Purbright said mildly. Bloxham glanced at it, then gave a short laugh. "My dear Inspector, I can barely read my own writing some days." "This means nothing to me." "Of course," Purbright murmured. "Still it is curious. Someone must have wished to silence our porter. Perhaps because he spoke to Mr. Hargreaves about events in 1953, Bloxham's eyes narrowed, though his smile remained. Old stories, Inspector. Best forgotten. They'll do no good dragged out now." Purbright regarded him with gentle persistence. "Forgotten things, Mr. Bloxham, have a habit of turning up again, like misplaced books or bodies in cupboards." For a moment, Bloxham's expression flickered with irritation before the smile returned. "If you're suggesting I know anything about this unfortunate solicitor, you're mistaken."
I'll not have my name smeared by gossip. Purbright nodded gravely.
Indeed, gossip is a very poor thing. That is why we seek facts. And the fact is, Mr. Bloxham, someone thought Groom worth silencing. That someone must be very anxious indeed. When Bloxham left, his politeness somewhat frayed, Purbright sat back in his chair with a faint smile. The counsellor's composure had cracked, not yet enough to reveal guilt, but enough to show fear. And fear, in Purbright's experience, was the surest guide through the labyrinth of Flaxborough's respectability. The inspector knew the next stage must be to press gently upon Groom once more, to coax from him the fragment of truth he still concealed. The porter held the key, not to the crime itself perhaps, but to the door behind which the guilty huddled, and Purbright intended, with the patience of a man turning a library key in a well-oiled lock, to open it. Purbright had long since learned that the truth was seldom pried from men with threats or accusations, but more often coaxed out by patience and silence. Groom was a case in point. The porter's natural instinct was to shrink from attention, to wrap himself in routine and hope the world passed him by. But Purbright knew that fear, once it had taken hold, was rarely content to be smothered. It pressed upward like water under a door, seeping into every crevice of thought until the man holding it back either spoke or broke. 2 days after Bloxham's interview, Purbright returned to the library under the pretext of consulting some reference material. He found Groom outside in the yard, oiling a bicycle chain that looked as weary as its owner. The man nodded without enthusiasm, his eyes sliding away from the inspector's. "Mr. Groom," Purbright began conversationally, "I am told you are something of a fixture here. Must be strange to see the place change while you remain constant?" Groom grunted. "Building's still the same."
Only the people come and go. Quite so, Purbright said, lowering his voice.
"And one of those people came to you asking about things long past. Mr. Hargreaves." The porter's hands tightened on the spanner. "I never told him anything worth killing a man over." "That," Purbright replied gently, "is exactly what I wanted to hear. You see, someone believes otherwise. They thought you dangerous enough to threaten, which suggests, Mr. Groom, that even what you think of as nothing may be something to another." The man's eyes flickered with a troubled light. For a moment, his lips parted as though words might spill out, but he clamped them shut again and returned to his chain. Purbright did not press further. He merely stood, watching with the air of a man content to wait. It was 2 evenings later, in the half-light of closing time, that Groom appeared at the station. He stood awkwardly in the doorway until Love noticed him. When brought to Purbright, he looked pale, his hands shaking slightly. "I've thought about it," he muttered, staring at the floor. "And you were right."
"It's not nothing."
Purbright offered him a chair and tea, which he accepted with a gulp more nervous than thirsty. "It were years ago," Groom began, his voice low. "When they were building the extension, there were crates brought in at night, not during working hours. Said it was records for storage, council papers, but they didn't go on the shelves. They were carried straight to the basement and locked away.
I remember because I had to help shift them. Heavy they were.
And when I asked what was in them, Mr. Bloxham told me to mind my own business. Said they'd never see daylight again. Did you open one?" Purbright asked quietly. Groom shook his head.
Only caught sight of some papers.
Looked old, yellowed, not the sort of thing you'd throw out.
I reckon they were minutes of meetings or deeds, something like that.
But the way they hurried them down there, like smuggling contraband. And Hargreaves? He asked me if I remembered anything unusual about the building work.
I told him about the crates.
He went pale, then he laughed, said I'd given him just what he needed. He promised he'd put things right, that it wasn't too late.
That's the last I saw of him. Silence stretched in the room.
Love shifted uneasily, but Purbright remained very still, watching Groom as though considering the shape of the man's conscience. "You've done the right thing," Purbright said at last. "Now we must see what remains in that basement." When Groom had gone, Purbright leaned back and steepled his fingers. The cupboard grows larger, love. What our solicitor discovered was not merely irregular leases, but records that someone feared to let out. Concealed evidence locked away in the heart of the library. Love's face brightened. So we'll search the basement? Purbright nodded.
Yes, though not tonight.
A premature inspection would only alert our friends. I propose we visit quietly unannounced and see what has been kept in the dark. The opportunity presented itself 2 days later, on a rain-lashed afternoon when the library was nearly deserted. Mrs. Beckwith, after a polite but anxious summons from Purbright, reluctantly produced the keys to the basement. I must warn you, Inspector, she said in tones of disapproval, that the archives below are in considerable disorder.
I cannot answer for what you will find. Purbright bowed slightly.
That, madam, is precisely what we hope for. The descent into the basement was through a narrow stair, the air growing cooler and damp with each step. At the bottom stretched a corridor of stone, lined with wooden doors. Dust lay thick upon the floor, disturbed only by the scurry of rats. Love carried a lantern, which cast long shadows across the walls. They passed through one room of broken furniture, another of bundled newspapers, before Purbright halted at a locked door whose surface bore the faint imprint of once-nailed notices. "This," he said softly,
"it has not been disturbed for many years." With Mrs. Beckwith's reluctant aid, the lock was opened. Inside stood rows of crates, their lids nailed shut.
The air was heavy with the smell of old paper. Purbright approached one, prized up the lid, and drew out a sheaf of documents, minutes of council meetings, leases, correspondence, records dating back decades. As Purbright flicked through them, his expression grew intent. "These," he murmured, "are the bones beneath our respectable facade. Here are the missing records Hargreaves sought.
And here," he held up a lease, yellow with age, bearing signatures now prominent in Flaxborough society.
Here is the proof of land transferred under curious conditions." Love leaned over his shoulder. "Looks like they were selling council property for pennies." "To themselves," Purbright replaced the papers carefully. "Precisely. And Hargreaves must have found reference to these. That is why he had to be stopped. Not for what he had already published, but for what he was about to expose." They replaced the lid and withdrew, locking the door again with due care. On their return to the station, Love asked, "Shall we seize the lot?" "Not yet," Purbright replied. "Let them think their secret still sleeps. If we move too soon, we shall find ourselves chasing shadows. Better to let them believe the cupboard remains closed." That evening, Purbright sat alone in his office, reflecting on the shape of events. The solicitor's murder was no random violence. It was the calculated act of those desperate to preserve a profitable silence. Groom's memory had unlocked the first door. The basement had yielded the second. Yet one question remained. Who, among the living, had been willing to strike the fatal blow? Bloxham was the obvious figure, but Purbright doubted he had dirtied his own hands. There were others, council clerks, builders, businessmen, who had profited from the vanished records. And among them, somewhere, lay the man or men who had decided that Hargreaves must vanish into the cupboard of history himself. The inspector knew the time was approaching to stir the nest more boldly, to force the guilty into betraying themselves. The town's quiet respectability was a fragile skin stretched over greed and fear, and with the right pressure, it would split. As the church bell tolled the hour, Purbright rose and looked out upon the lamp-lit square. The rain had ceased, leaving the cobbles shining. Somewhere in those darkened houses lay men who slept uneasily, men who feared the cupboard door might be opened again, and Purbright, with patient precision, intended to be the man who opened it. The following morning, a faint mist lingered over the rooftops of Flaxborough. The the kind that dulled chimneys into smudges and softened the angles of shop signs until they seemed to sag with fatigue. Purbright, walking to the station with his usual deliberate pace, was thinking less of the weather than of the subtle shift he had sensed among the townsfolk. Eyes lingered on him more than usual, whispers seemed to hush when he drew near. It was the symptom of a population that knew a net was being drawn, and every man wondered if its cords might tighten about him. At his desk, Love was frowning at a stack of clippings spread across the blotter.
"I've been through Hargreaves's articles, sir."
There's a pattern, I think. Every piece he wrote about shady dealings, whether property or contracts, he linked back to the same cluster of names. Always carefully, mind you, never an outright accusation, just hints. A lease that favoured one councillor's cousin, a contract for paving awarded to a firm that charged twice the going rate. But it's always the same circle. Alderman Sprod, Councillor Tuttle, Bloxham,
And he tapped the paper with his pencil. One or two lesser fellows who seemed to have vanished from public life altogether. Purbright leaned over, studying the names with mild interest.
a spider's web, Love, and Hargreaves had begun to trace its strands. It is no wonder he was plucked from it before he could call too much attention. "Do we bring them in, sir?" Love asked, a hopeful eagerness in his tone. "Not yet," Purbright replied. "We should first see how they behave when reminded that their web is visible to others. A summons too early gives them unity. A little uncertainty may encourage them to quarrel among themselves. That is usually more fruitful." The opportunity came at a council committee session 2 evenings later. Purbright attended not in any official capacity but as a quiet observer, slipping into the public gallery with the air of a man who had mistaken the place for a concert. The agenda was as dull as anyone could wish: budgets for road repairs, an extension to the refuse collection schedule, but beneath the routine words, Purbright detected the faint ripple of nerves. Bloxham spoke less fluently than usual, his smile faltered when Tuttle asked a pointed question, and Sprod, normally a fountain of joviality, sweated noticeably despite the chill draught of the hall. It was when a minor motion was raised concerning library maintenance that the drama began. Tuttle remarked, offhandedly, but with pointed malice, that the basement was unfit for purpose and perhaps in need of clearing. Bloxham, who had until then been fiddling with his notes, dropped his pen and stared with undisguised alarm. The silence that followed was broken only by the shuffle of papers. It was clear that those present understood more than the words conveyed. Purbright, hands folded, watched carefully. The fissure he had hoped for was opening. Later that night, as the members drifted out, Purbright intercepted Alderman Sprod. The big man attempted his usual hearty greeting, but could not conceal the unease in his eyes. "Alderman," Purbright said pleasantly, "a word if you don't mind."
"I noticed tonight that your colleague seemed unusually troubled at the thought of library basements. One wonders what ghosts he expects to find there." Sprod forced a laugh that sounded more like a cough.
"You policemen always seeing mysteries."
"It's nothing at all."
"Old records, dusty rubbish. I dare say we'd all be happier if the place was emptied, that's all." "Perhaps," Purbright replied with mild politeness, "though sometimes dust is more informative than we expect."
"It tends to cling to whoever stirs it." Sprod muttered a vague farewell and lumbered away, but his discomfort was as good as a confession.
The inspector returned to the station, where Love awaited him with fresh tea and a look of inquiry. "They are beginning to turn on one another," Purbright said. "Tuttle prods, Bloxham trembles, Sprod sweats. Presently one of them will act, too hastily, I imagine, in an effort to protect himself. That is when the truth will show itself." His prediction was borne out sooner than expected. 2 nights later, a fire broke out in the library. It began in the basement, naturally, and though the flames were contained before they reached the upper rooms, a considerable quantity of old records was destroyed. The smell of charred paper lingered in the air long after the smoke was quenched. When Purbright arrived, summoned by a breathless constable, he found Mrs. Beckwith wringing her hands on the pavement, declaring to anyone who would listen that it was an outrage upon knowledge. Inside, the fireman worked amid the smouldering debris. Purbright, careful to keep his hands in his pockets, surveyed the scene with a grave calm.
An accident?
He asked the captain. Hard to say, sir. Fire started among old wooden crates. Could be faulty wiring, could be a match. Purbright nodded, though his expression suggested he leaned firmly towards the latter explanation. Love, beside him, muttered, "They've tried to burn their cupboard clean." "Indeed," Purbright murmured, "and in doing so they have shown us which cupboard matters most." The next morning, Purbright visited Bloxham at his chambers. The solicitor was pale, his hands trembling slightly as he poured tea. He insisted at once that the fire had nothing to do with him, though Purbright had not asked. "It's outrageous, Inspector. Destruction of borough property. I trust you'll find the culprit swiftly. Such vandalism must not be tolerated." Purbright studied him with polite interest. "You are quite right, sir."
"And it will not be tolerated."
"You see, arson has a curious quality. It rarely destroys quite everything. In fact, it often draws attention to what was most urgently intended to be lost."
"Fire is a clumsy censer." Bloxham's cup rattled against its saucer.
He made no reply. Outside, Purbright paused with Love at the top of the steps. "He is afraid. Not that we have found nothing, but that we may have found something he thought consumed." "And have we, sir?" Love asked. Purbright allowed himself the faintest of smiles. "Let us say the fireman's water did not discriminate. Some papers were soaked rather than burned. Enough, I think, to confirm what Hargreaves had begun to trace." Love's eyes widened. "So now we've got them?" "Not yet. We have proof of corruption, certainly. But proof of murder is another matter. And it is murder we must lay at their feet, not merely dishonest leases. For corruption, they will squirm and shrug. For blood, they will break." That evening, Purbright sat once more in his office, the rescued documents spread across his desk. They told a story of land misappropriated, contracts skewed, money siphoned quietly through shell companies. The signatures were plain, the beneficiaries obvious, yet none of it explained who had lured Hargreaves to his death. Purbright considered each man in turn. Bloxham, too nervous to act with his own hands. Sprod, blustering but cautious. Tuttle, sharp and sly, fond of needling others into rashness. Of the three, Tuttle alone had the temperament to arrange violence while appearing uninvolved. But temperament was not proof. The inspector leaned back, closing his eyes. Somewhere, in the detail of Groom's recollection, in the rumours of the ledger, in the whispers of the town, lay the clue that would turn suspicion into certainty. The time had come, he decided, to set a small trap, not of force, but of words. A question, placed in the right ear, could do what no cell of constables could manage. As the station clock struck 10, Purbright rose and extinguished his lamp. The papers were returned to their folders, the key turned in the cabinet. Tomorrow, he resolved, would be the day of his test. The town of Flaxborough, with its lamps glimmering in mist and its people muttering in drawing-rooms, waited unaware. Somewhere among them was a man who had written another's death into the ledger of silence, and who would, with the gentlest prompting,
write himself in as well. The next morning dawned bright.
A rare concession of sunshine to Flaxborough. It spilled over the cobbles with an air almost festive, though the inspector knew such weather had a knack for emboldening men who might otherwise keep indoors with their secrets. Purbright arrived at the station in his usual unhurried manner, his umbrella neatly furled, his expression as calm as ever. Yet beneath the civility of his appearance lay a quiet resolve. Today he intended to lift the veil. He summoned Sergeant Love and explained his plan with characteristic understatement. "It is time," he said, "to give our friends the chance to tell us more than they mean to. A little gathering under the pretext of clarification. We shall invite Bloxham, Alderman Sprod, and Councillor Tuttle. Their tongues may wag more freely in one another's company than in isolation." Love looked doubtful. "Do you think they'll all come, sir? Won't they smell a trap?" "Most men," Purbright replied, "fear absence more than presence. An empty chair suggests guilt louder than any word. They will come, for the sake of appearances if nothing else." By mid-afternoon, the three men were assembled in the station's conference room, a place usually reserved for the tedious reading of regulations. The walls, painted an uninspiring beige, bore witness to countless yawns, but today they enclosed a silence thick with unease. Bloxham fiddled with his tie, Sprod dabbed his brow with a handkerchief, and Tuttle sat very straight, his lips curved in a faint, ironic smile. Purbright began with the politeness of a host at a tea party. "Gentlemen, thank you for coming. I shall not detain you long. It is simply that questions have arisen concerning certain borough records, recently damaged by fire. You will understand that we are obliged to establish whether those records included matters of legal significance." Bloxham shifted in his seat.
"Inspector, if you are implying—" Purbright raised a hand, the gesture courteous yet silencing.
"Implying nothing, Mr. Bloxham. We are merely clarifying. It is curious, is it not, that a solicitor such as Mr. Hargreaves should take such an interest in long-forgotten leases? Curious, too, that shortly after making inquiries he should vanish from this world." At the name, Bloxham paled further, while Sprod muttered something about coincidence. Tuttle, however, leaned back and steepled his fingers, regarding Purbright with something close to amusement. "You have a theory, Inspector," he said softly. "Why not share it? We are all men of sense here." Purbright inclined his head. "Very well. My theory is this, that Mr. Hargreaves uncovered irregularities in council business, irregularities documented in records long hidden in the library basement. I believe he intended to publish his findings, but before he could, someone ensured his silence. His name was added, one might say, to the wrong sort of ledger. No one spoke. The clock ticked, loud in the hush. Purbright allowed the silence to lengthen, knowing it would weigh more heavily than any accusation. At last, Sprod blustered.
"You can't prove such things. Men die every day."
"You'd need evidence, real evidence, not just rumours of old papers." "Indeed," Purbright said mildly. "And evidence, as it happens, survives even fire. Some documents were soaked rather than burned."
"Among them are leases showing property transferred to shell companies, companies linked to the very men in this room." Bloxham gave a strangled sound as if protest had stuck in his throat.
Tuttle's smile faded, though his composure remained. Purbright continued. "But corruption alone, as I have said before, does not interest me half so much as blood. The question is not who profited from the leases, that is plain enough, but who feared exposure so greatly that he turned from pen to dagger." Bloxham's trembling increased.
"I never touched him. I swear it. I wanted only to quieten him, to persuade him to delay."
"It was Tuttle who—" "Be silent," snapped Tuttle, his voice sharp for the first time. But the damage was done. Purbright's gaze turned to the counsellor, who met it steadily, though a faint flush betrayed him. "Counsellor," the inspector said gently, "you are a clever man, too clever perhaps for your companions. When Hargreaves pressed Groom for his memories, it was you who saw the danger. You arranged the meeting, thinking it would be easy to silence him, and easier still to let suspicion rest elsewhere. But you overlooked one thing." Tuttle's lips tightened. "And what, pray, is that?" "That human memory," Purbright replied, "is rarely obedient. Groom remembered the crates. Miss Gorse remembered the ledger, and I remembered to listen. Your misfortune, counsellor, is that you thought the past could be hidden in a cupboard. But cupboards have a habit of being opened." For the first time, Tuttle's calm broke. He rose abruptly, knocking his chair against the wall.
"This is absurd," he cried. "You have no witnesses, no proof."
Purbright's voice remained as quiet as ever. "On the contrary, we have Bloxham, who has just confirmed your involvement. We have records that survived your attempt at erasure. And we have the fact that only you possessed the nerve and the opportunity to turn threat into murder. That, counsellor, is proof enough. Tuttle stood rigid for a moment, his chest heaving, then slowly sank back into his chair. The fight seemed to drain from him. Sprod dabbed his brow again, muttering incoherently, while Bloxham sat as though awaiting a sentence already pronounced. Purbright allowed the silence to settle once more before signalling to Love, who stepped forward with a steadiness that belied his eagerness. "You may take Mr. Tuttle into custody, Sergeant." As Love guided the counsellor away, Purbright turned to the remaining two. "As for you, gentlemen, your dealings will no doubt interest other authorities. My concern ends with the life that was taken. But rest assured, others will wish to examine your accounts more closely." Bloxham groaned softly. Sprod muttered something about persecution. Neither man met the inspector's eyes. When the room was empty again, Purbright stood at the window, gazing out upon the square. Children ran laughing across the cobbles, their voices carrying in the clear air. Life in Flaxborough continued as it always did, heedless of the scandals beneath its surface. Love returned, his expression a mixture of satisfaction and awe. "You had him, sir, all along," Purbright smiled faintly. "Not all along, Sergeant."
Only once he began to fear I might. And the others?
"They will wriggle, no doubt, but wriggling has its uses. It tears away the last threads of respectability. By the time they are done, the town will know them for what they are. That is punishment enough." Love looked thoughtful.
Strange, isn't it, sir? All that fuss over old papers. Not strange at all, Purbright said.
"Men will kill for money, yes, but more often they kill for the preservation of appearances. To be thought respectable, to be seen as pillars of the town, that is the most valuable currency here."
And the most fragile. The inspector gathered his papers, placing them neatly in a folder.
The business was concluded, at least in so far as it concerned him. Outside, the sun still shone on the roofs of Flaxborough, indifferent to the secrets that smouldered beneath. In a few days, the gossip would cool, the town would return to its routines, and the ledger of corpses would be filed away at last, not in a cupboard of concealment, but in the quiet archive
of memory, where Inspector Purbright kept his
cases. Inspector Purbright returned to his office with the steady tread of a man who never quite managed to hurry and never quite seemed idle either. The stack of papers awaiting him on his desk had grown imperceptibly during the past days of inquiry, a silent tribute to the constancy of police bureaucracy. Love, death, and civic embarrassment might come and go in Flaxborough, but forms had to be filled regardless. On this particular morning, the market square was doing its best to reassert its old rhythms. A flower stall gleamed with bedraggled chrysanthemums, the fishmonger bellowed his wares, and two councillors argued with elaborate cordiality about whose committee had wasted less money the previous quarter. The brief, strange disruption caused by Miss Fallowfield's hidden trove of grim cargo was already being nudged aside in favour of gossip about the price of lamb and the rector's wife's new hat. For many in Flaxborough, comfort was to be found not in the solving of mysteries, but in the resumption of habit. Miss Lucilla Fallowfield herself had been conveyed, with considerable reluctance on her part, to a quieter establishment several miles away. Protective custody was how the inspector had described it when asked by the Flaxborough Chronicle. The paper in turn described it to its readers as an enforced rest of indeterminate length, conducive to meditation. That, in a town where euphemism was both art and necessity, was considered sufficiently explanatory. A handful of readers muttered in their parlours about whether she would ever return to catalogue the annals of local learning, but no one pressed the matter further. The library would find another guardian. It always had. Purbright, meanwhile, was patient enough to let the town's digestion settle. He took tea with Sergeant Love and, after a companionable silence, remarked that it was remarkable how efficiently human beings could adapt to horror provided that it was decently tidied away and carried out of sight. Love, ever literal, nodded in agreement and added that the library smelt better already. What was to be done with Miss Fallowfield's discoveries, or, more properly, with her peculiar sense of duty, was not in the inspector's gift to decide. Medical men and legal gentlemen would have their say, and she would, in time, be regarded as either mad, wicked, or both. Yet Purbright, who trusted neither doctors' certainties nor lawyers' rhetoric, kept his own counsel. He preferred to think of her as one more example of how the seemingly humdrum souls of Flaxborough concealed, sometimes under cardigans, sometimes under respectable committee memberships, fancies, vices and delusions of a most exotic nature. The citizens themselves had already chosen a version of the affair that suited them best. To some, the librarian was a tragic woman, undone by loneliness and morbid books. To others, she was a faintly comic eccentric whose peculiarities had at last become intolerable to Providence.
A few, those who had found themselves in the inspector's notebook during earlier inquiries,
simply thanked fortune that, for once, scandal had touched someone else. Mrs. Poole of Poole's haberdashery told any customer lingering near the button display that she had always suspected something unwholesome in Miss Fallowfield's fondness for dusty cupboards. Councillor Copping, ever ready to locate opportunity in disgrace, wondered aloud whether the library might be modernized altogether, by which he meant better lit, more expensive, and attributed to his committee's foresight. The vicar, when pressed, confined himself to the opinion that the incident reminded him of a passage in Leviticus which he could not at that moment recall but was quite sure would be relevant. For Inspector Purbright the interest was of another order. He had been struck less by the woman's macabre practice than by her calm insistence that it was a service, a proper cataloguing of what others were too squeamish to face. In its way, it was a distorted reflection of the very civic pride that animated so many of Flaxborough's respectable inhabitants. She wished to have her town tidy, its dead accounted for, its records complete.
Madness, perhaps, but a madness not entirely alien to the place in which it had sprouted. One late afternoon,
as drizzle polished the cobbles to their usual gloss, Purbright permitted himself a stroll past the library. The doors were barred now, and a notice from the Borough Council promised temporary closure for essential reorganization. Through the glass one could see the long tables stretched beneath dim lamps, dust motes already reclaiming the air. To any passer-by it was a silent, dreary room. To Purbright it seemed still to hum faintly with the echo of whispered confidences, of secrets folded between cataloguing slips, of civic proprieties stretched a fraction too far. Sergeant Love joined him and remarked that he could not imagine anyone wanting to go back inside. Purbright, watching the rain find its way between the stones, replied that there was no shortage of people who would go in eagerly, if only to prove that they had not been frightened. Reassurance, he said, is one of the cheapest commodities in Flaxborough, though sometimes the cost is rather higher than anyone admits. They walked on, and the inspector allowed the matter to slip from conversation. His work would resume its quieter tempo now, a petty theft at the railway buffet, an intemperate letter sent to the Chronicle, a case of hens mysteriously disappearing from a shed whose owner was more culpable than any thief. The life of the town, nudged but not transformed, carried forward, and he with it. Some weeks later, when the first frost made even the market traders hurry, Flaxborough had achieved the remarkable feat of forgetting almost entirely what had so troubled it. The library, painted a lighter shade, opened with a modest ceremony at which no mention was made of its recent notoriety. Councillor Copping cut a ribbon. The Chronicle published a paragraph. People borrowed novels again, though they preferred, for a time, those with cheerful titles. Purbright sat in his office, completed a report, and quietly sharpened a pencil. To the casual observer he appeared content, even complacent. Yet, as ever, behind his mild eyes lingered a recognition that the lives around him, however ordinary, concealed more curious impulses than most of their owners would dare confess, and from time to time those impulses would protrude, like a misfiled card sticking out of its drawer. To be noticed by anyone who chose to look, he closed his drawer, placed the sharpened pencil neatly alongside its fellows and rose. Outside, Flaxborough went about its endless, comic, faintly sinister business. He adjusted his hat and went out to meet it.